This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be watching or listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicars Crossing podcast. The Vicars Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square and where you intersect with us once again. So welcome back. If you're a regular listener of the program, or if you're the first time checking us out, we welcome you aboard and glad you're here. My name is Rob Henderson, and I am the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
This is London, Ontario, is what I understand. And there's another London, they told me the other day. But that's what they say. But anyway, I'm Kevin George. I'm at another church in London, like London, Ontario, St. Aidan's Church. Glad to be here.
My name is Ian. I am not at any church at the moment.
At the moment.
At the moment.
At the moment.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not at church right now. I'm in my dining room.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. The only guy who's actually technically at church is me. But we're all at church because the church is wherever we are.
That's right. Exactly.
Yes.
And this is season 3 of the Vicars Crossing, episode 11. Can you believe it, guys? 11 episodes in.
I think it's 11. Hold on. I think it's episode 12. Because episode 11 was Clint.
Okay, so maybe it's episode 12. The guy who writes the notes, show notes, not a very reliable guy.
Not a guy?
Not
my
a
type of
guy. This guy sometimes gets numbers mixed up. What can I say?
Okay, well, for those keeping count, it is episode 12. We'll trust you on that one.
Sorry, Robbie.
No worries at all. I want to say hi to our sponsors, as always, here at the Vicars Crossing, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. And many thanks to Dave Mullen for his great support.
Thank you, Dave. You're a good man. Our shout out as well to Carol Basada over at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, here in Hyde Park. Hey, Carol, how you doing? Good to hear you. See you and everything else. But Carol's always out there with all the drugs needed. Locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. You can't get better service. So check her out.
And many thanks to Molly Maid London. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And many thanks to Trisha Lister for that, too.
Trisha!
Hey, nice. Way to go, Trisha. We're shouting out to you. And if you got anybody out there, Trisha, that can go clean Ian's room, please send them along.
he could leave.
My room is fine.
There's a big cat fur ball over there under by the door.
Fur ball right under his door. I could see it.
Other than that, it's fine.
All right, guys. Hope you're doing well.
All right.
And we're wearing our orange today for a very specific reason. We're thrilled to be able to welcome into the Vicars Crossing today Archbishop Mark Macdonald, indigenous bishop of the Anglican Church of Canada. And he's going to be here to talk about, among other things, Orange Shirt Day, which is coming up September 30th, right, is the official date. But I know a lot of things are happening in different churches around our diocese and the national church on the 27th, right? So Kevin's got the official shirt, right, which says every child matters. Yeah, exactly.
Hashtag that, baby.
All right. So
I have an orange hat that matches, and I think it matches your shirt.
It does. This is my orange. I got my tiger shirt on today.
So we have matching sports. And we're told Ian's shirt is orange.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, the light that I have on makes it look kind of red, but it is orange. Trust me on this. It is orange.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay, we'll let you alone.
Okay, so we're looking forward to welcoming Archbishop Mark into the Vicars Crossing Zoom room here in just a minute. But before we get to him, we want to play another edition of Sickness or Suds. we go. So sickness or suds, as mentioned before we started recording today, Ian's kind of been, not doing real well on our sickness and suds game show here. So Ian, this is your opportunity to get
bring it
back in the
back.
game, my friend. All right, you
Yeah.
ready?
Now's your
Oh yeah,
chance.
definitely. 100% ready.
So the word or phrase for you guys to try to figure out if it's a sickness or sud today is hoodoo.
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 Who
H-O-O.
do you think you are?
Yeah, just sound it out.
Say
as
it
we
again.
say here on the Vicars Crossing. Sound it out.
Sound it out.
Hoodoo. 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 Is hoodoo a sickness, as in, boy, my hoodoo's really acting up, or a sud, like bartender, another hoodoo for me and my orange friends?
Wow. What do you think, Ian?
Hoodoo.
You gonna
So
go
Ian,
first
I'll
today?
let you go first.
I'm gonna You know what? I'm gonna go with sickness on this one. I am
Are
gonna
you
go
gonna
with
go with
sickness on this
sickness?
one. I am gonna go with sickness.
Would you like to try to use it in a sentence?
Yeah.
You know what? I'm good.
Okay. All right.
All right.
So you're sort of the mind that, I tried to get to work today, but the hoodoo had me down and out, is your understanding.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm going to say that hoodoo is a sud. It's a beer, something really crafty, hoppy, who knows. But I feel like for me in a sentence, it would be, oh gosh, it's been such a long day. I can't wait to get home, put my feet open and crack open a hoodoo.
Well, once again, Ian's taken another step back in the Sickness or Suds game show because hoodoo is actually a beer.
Okay,
Wow.
where's it
It is
hail
a beer.
from? Where does it hail from?
This is great. It's a stout.
Okay.
I know you're a fan of the stout, aren't you?
Yeah, I do like a good stout, yeah.
Good stout. Hoodoo is an Alaskan beer that's brewed at the Hoodoo Brewing Company.
Okay.
And I picked that one specifically because Archbishop Mark was the Episcopal bishop of the church in Alaska.
That's right.
So he spent a lot of time up there, almost a decade.
Maybe he had some
in
hoodoo.
that diocese. So maybe I was going to ask him if he'd ever enjoyed
Hoodoo.
a glass of hoodoo. So there you go. That's sickness or suds.
All
Good
right.
to
Wow.
know.
And now for game show 2.
Yeah.
It's time for
Ask Ian anything.
Ooh, getting a little shaky
Who-
there.
Who do we have today, Kevin?
Who do you love?
Yeah. Who do you love? So today's question comes from Petoskey, Michigan.
Okay.
It's up in the north part of the Mitt. And
Spent a week one day there.
Did you? Yeah,
One
beautiful
day,
area.
yes.
My wife's grandparents are from up there. I used to spend quite a bit of time there when they were alive. Beautiful community. Anyway, we have a question from Ralphie, who's up there. Ralphie is
Right, hey, Ralphie boy.
Yep. Ralphie is curious about back to school. Ralphie
Of
pays
course.
attention, and since we got going here, you had your first back to school day.
Yep.
He wants to know now you're back to school. What is it about back to school that you find most difficult or troubling right now in these COVID times?
I think personally it's a lot of the times we have lectures over Zoom. And as you know, with this podcast, I'm very familiar with Zoom.
Yes.
But I feel like you're missing out on a lot of like sort of camaraderie, like before class and after class, kind of just hanging out. I think that's what I'm missing the most with Zoom. Like it kind of restricts that because only one person can really talk at a time, or else everything goes to glitchiness and stuff.
Right.
Mhm.
Do you have any on-campus stuff at all?
I do have a couple of on-campus things, and in my program we have scheduled studio times.
Okay.
And usually studios 1 and 3 are for the first years, and 2 and 4 are for the second years. And I'm a
Okay.
second year, and they changed it this year because of COVID. So studios 3, 4, and 2 are for second years, and studio 1 is for first years. So we get an
Yeah.
extra studio time, means we have more studio time, which is exciting.
Wow.
So that's positive. And I have audio post-production and audio engineering in class. But they're kind of restricted because you can't have a specific amount you can't have more than like 10 people in a class. And yeah, but it's kind of my attitude has changed since starting,
Yeah.
which is good. But yeah,
But
So-
I feel bad for you guys because you're not getting the experience, right? That full
yeah,
post-secondary experience of college, university, wherever people are at. Because there is an experience that you get being connected and meeting people and being in that
True.
world, right? And then to have to
Yeah.
sit in your
Yeah.
bedroom, listen to your professor
Yeah.
at you. I mean, you're still getting stuff, obviously, but it's just it's too bad.
Well, as much as you can do, keep an eyeball out for young Robbie Agnew from Windsor. Robbie
Yeah.
Agnew is new into your program this year, so
Mhm.
Oh yeah,
I have to give him a shout out here on the podcast.
Yeah.
very good.
Anyway, Ian, you're a rock star, buddy. So whatever they throw at you, you're going to get through it anyway. So
Yeah, you'll get her.
yeah.
I'm excited.
I mean, if we translate it into church, Rob, what about what you like? We're back to church, back to school, sort of. What's the big challenge?
Well, it's the same thing. I think for me is the disconnection that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the great things I love about parish life and parish ministry is being connected to people and being able to, even the little things like, sitting after church and just having a coffee and having somebody tell you about what they've been doing that week or about a family member. And they oftentimes, this, Kevin, they'll invite you into a real holy space.
Yeah.
And which is a gift and to be part of people's lives. And that's not that we can't talk to people, but it certainly is in a different way. I mean, on Sunday, I finished our service and I stood, 6, 8, 10 feet back at the doors. People walked out and all I could do was wave, right? Yeah. Good to see you. It was like, I felt like that skit on Saturday Night Live, right? Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Leaving the airplane. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
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 So yeah, it's just that disconnection is probably the hardest.
Mhm.
What
Yeah,
about
it
you,
is.
Kev?
Well, same thing. It's weird. I mean, I've gotten to the point now where I get to the announcement at the end and I say, okay, thanks again for coming. Once again, there may be 50 ways to leave your lover, but there's only one way to leave this aircraft. So please, please exit from the rear, starting from the rear pews, please first.
That's
But
right.
it's all very odd. I like to socialize. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. And sort of the efficient way in which we have to bring people in and have them shuffled out at the end sort of takes away. But I must say to express gratitude, just how great it is to actually see people again and not be talking to an iPad for like 6 months. So
Yeah.
it's been cool. So you know what, Ralphie, we're getting along here in London, Ontario, buddy. So good luck to you guys up in Petoskey, Michigan. Your country is on fire. Literally and figuratively. You're burning over there, Ralphie. You better be voting on November 3rd, and it better not be for anybody whose skin looks like this shirt.
All right. Hey, what's that? Is
That sounds like an archbishop.
that an archbishop knocking?
That's an
All
archbishop.
right. We're going to bring in Archbishop Macdonald into the Vicars Crossing. So here he comes.
It's a beaut.
And here he is. Archbishop Mark Macdonald has joined us at the Vicars Crossing in our Zoom room today. Archbishop, we want to welcome you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Good to have you.
Should I do a little introduction?
Yeah,
Robbie?
would you give a formal introduction, please?
All right. Well, we're honored and pleased to have the Most Reverend Mark Macdonald with us, who became the Anglican Church of Canada's first national indigenous Anglican bishop in 2007, and last year was made Archbishop after serving as Bishop of the U.S. Episcopal Diocese of Alaska, where we learned earlier on our early segment that hoodoo beer comes from. We had a little chat about hoodoo beer before you came on.
I did not know that.
Well, there you go. So we have a segment that's called Sickness or Suds. Ian and I are left trying to guess if something is some sort of a disease or a beer. And today it was hoodoo. And it turns out hoodoo is a beer from Alaska. So
Alaskan Brewing Company. Yep.
So
I did not know.
this was a homecoming of sorts that we had Archbishop Macdonald come back to Canada, who had attended Wycliffe in Toronto and served as a priest in Mississauga. He was born the son of Blake and Sue Nell Macdonald. He holds a BA in Religious Studies, Psychology from the College of St. Scholastia in Duluth, Minnesota, and an MA in Divinity from Wycliffe. He did postgraduate work at Luther Northwestern Theological Seminary in Minneapolis. Archbishop Mark has a long and varied ministry, holding positions in Mississauga, Ontario, Duluth, Tomah, Wisconsin, Mouston, Portland, Oregon, and the Southeast Regional Mission of the Diocese of Navajo Land. Immediately prior to his ordination to the episcopate, Archbishop Macdonald was a canon missioner for training in the Diocese of Minnesota and vicar of St. Antipas Church and St. John in the Wilderness Red Lake Nation, Minnesota. He is the board chair of Church Innovations Incorporated, a third order Franciscan, an incredibly wonderful person. He's married to Virginia. They have 3 children. He's a gift to the church, and we're glad now that he is an alumnus of the Vicars Crossing. Welcome,
Yes.
Archbishop Mark.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Good to have you. Now I'm gonna run this thing over to the young fellow right now, and he's gonna take over with the first question.
Yes, I have the privilege of asking the first question, which is great. So in a historic vote in July 2019, General Synod decided almost unanimously to approve changes to Canon 22 that enabled a self-determining indigenous church within the Anglican Church of Canada. Then you were made the National Indigenous Archbishop of Canada. The process of becoming a self-determining indigenous church has been a long one. What has happened in the last year, and help our listener understand what this change means for indigenous peoples and for you?
Very good. Thank you. What the General Synod did was an extraordinary act of trust in what we're doing. And I think it can be explained best by saying, on the one hand, it said the indigenous church has the freedom to become its own expression of Anglican Christianity, so that applying the basic values, ideals, and principles that have guided the Anglican Church for these few centuries, applying them to the indigenous context, we now have the freedom to do that. And that's very, very important and significant. But the act of trust was the significance of making the National Indigenous Anglican Bishop a metropolitan, the same status as a metropolitan. In doing that, it was saying, yes, what you are doing, you have the freedom to do it, but you also have the authority of anything else. So even prior to what you've done, we recognize that it has an equivalent authority in the life of the whole Church of the Anglican Church of Canada. That's an extraordinary piece of work, and we're very blessed. Now, what's happened? You may have heard that there was a pandemic.
Really?
Yeah. That's why we're here.
That I figured, but that has dented some of the things that we were hoping to do. We were hoping to have a sacred circle, which is our large gathering in June, and we were hoping to go over the equivalent of constitutions and canons. And we have now, in addition to all sorts of other things that we've done related to the pandemic, we have now started to do a lot of work on putting together what we are calling our constitution and canon. So we are calling the constitutional part the covenant, and the canons we are calling our way of life, because we wish to weave together our indigenous, the practicalities and daily aspect of discipleship, yes, in our indigenous way into how we govern ourselves, how we do that. So, and that reflects a traditional kind of indigenous sensibility about how things happen. So, and we're in the process of doing all sorts of work. We hope to have the main body of it done within the next couple of months, and then we'll start bringing it out to all of our constituency, and we'll also bring it by Council of General Synod, the bishops as well. But it'll be 99.9% just the work of indigenous people.
Right, right.
It was a fantastic thing. I mean, I think it, at least a part of my concern last year when this happened was that it was lost in the weeds because, of course, of all the conversation about same-sex marriage, that, you know, we had done this incredible thing. You know, it really is, as you say, an extraordinary act of trust for a church that has behaved in such colonial ways to sort of at least name that and say, let's do things, let's endeavor to make an act of trust to do things differently.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it is
Sure.
very much so. I wanted to ask you a question, Archbishop, about an article or an essay that you wrote in a recent book. The title of the book is Green Shoots Out of Dry Land, Growing a New Future for the Church in Canada. And you wrote an essay that was titled The Surprising and Improbable Mission of God Among the Indigenous People of Canada. And you write that while we can talk broadly in the church about the effects of colonialism in the church, what we are not so aware of is the ability of the Spirit to jump ship, as you put it. And you write this, that there are mostly hidden aspects of this history that should not be missed. The story of the gospel in Indigenous life is also an account of the trajectory of the living Word of God among Indigenous peoples. This is the Word that became incarnate in Jesus, but it is also the Word that shaped and continues to shape creation. This Word moves through history toward the end God has planned for all, and this same Word interacts with humanity and its many cultures toward this goal, creating all that forms and sustains life among us. I wonder if you could perhaps discuss this notion a bit more, that there is and always has been a capacity for Indigenous enculturation of the gospel.
Yeah, good. I'm very happy to do that. To me, that's an exciting story, and one that gets lost. Most of the public conversation about Indigenous people and their relationship to the gospel has been written by anthropologists who regretted the gospel's presence. You know, I guess you could say it contaminated the specimen that they were examining. And then the church that said, these folks never do it the way we want to. So what happened was, you know, and I should say, so up until 1960, it was illegal for Indigenous people to practice their own spirituality, and
Right.
and I hesitate to use the word religion, but I'll use it here with not it's a squishy word
Right.
here.
Yeah.
So what you had percolating under the noses of the missionaries and the anthropologists was a very vigorous and vibrant expression of the Christian faith. Both of the accounts that have primarily been written and continue to be the way in which academics talk about Indigenous people, it robs them of any agency. It was as if they just sat there and did whatever the missionaries told them to. We understand it very, very differently, and that there were a number of vehicles that you might say carried the gospel apart from the work of the missionaries, and the missionaries often would say, well, you know, the message got here before I did, you know, and they often saw their role as to clean it up, you know, again, the church, to a lesser extent, thanks be to God, isn't that way today, but still has some, you know, the church says, if you want to be good, you know, if you want to get someplace, be like us. And that is So they wanted to replicate in these on reserves and in indigenous communities the life of an Anglican suburban parish. And and they funded it for a while, it never was really successful in penetrating people's minds and hearts. But that's not to say that the gospel didn't penetrate people's minds and hearts.
Right.
So what you see is a hymn singing tradition, very rich, that not only shapes the way the hymns are sung, but also shapes the lyrics. So the lyrics was a place where a very robust theological discussion went on about how the old ways relate to to this new message. And so it's really extraordinary, exciting, and I'm trying to get young academics to study this and say, there's a book by a woman named Susan Nayland, who The Heavens Are Changing, in which she documents how catechists took the message, shaped it in their culture. In other words, the word became flesh in their culture, and the impact that had. So again, this is not the common narrative,
no,
but it is, I think, a testimony to the quiet power of the gospel through the work of the Spirit to create something wonderful and unexpected, and even now somewhat hidden from people's eyes. Yeah.
and almost in spite of colonial church in a way. I mean, I like that expression you use of the Spirit jumping ship from the institutional colonial English church to affect incredible incarnational realities in First Nations and indigenous communities that didn't need permission from Mother England to make. The Spirit didn't need that permission to do its work.
Right, absolutely. And there's a very interesting article written by a Jewish man who was a supporter of the Gwich'in people in the Northwest Arctic of North America, in which he describes how, much to his surprise, that the mixture of Anglican Christianity and Gwich'in culture created not just a way to cope with colonization, but a way to resist colonization.
Oh, interesting.
And so, it really took an Orthodox Jewish man to be able to see what was going on. And so again, it wasn't just a way to cope. No. In many instances, it was a way to resist. So Albert Tritt, who was the great prophet of the Gwich'in people, he said, the way of the white man leads to death, the way of Jesus leads to life. And so that in a capsule is the way in which Christian faith becoming alive in the culture was a way that not only allowed people to cope, but allowed them to survive in their own cultural way.
Wow. Yeah, I'm hoping that you're right, that somebody picks this work up and does it, because one of the conversations, one of our faithful listeners on here, Peter Anderson, says we're very good at celebrating our Celtic heritage in the church and going and bringing things back from overseas to do in our communities. And he says, and he's a white settler person too, but he says, we've got all this rich indigenous tradition here in this country that we're ignorant of, that we don't know about, and how wonderful it will be for us to begin to celebrate those things and to hold up what the Spirit has been doing here in this part of the world. instead of laying on yet again what's happened back into motherland, so to speak.
Right. I think about times of my formation in school and seminary and preparation to be in leadership in the church. And that was not brought up. It wasn't something that we were, asked to look at and think about. And yeah, like you say, the hope is to have more of that being put out so that those that are offering themselves into leadership in the church have some background on that. It's going to be important.
Yes.
And it's important. Go ahead. Sorry, Archbishop.
No, that's okay. I wanted to say, the spirituality of indigenous people is like the spirituality of Scripture, deeply embedded in the landscape that where it comes from, and so and there's a symbiotic relationship between land, language, and culture, and the spiritual faith. And so what's happening? You see, the first generations of people coming from Europe, they try to replicate Europe over here, and they fight. They make houses that aren't so good for this climate, and so on and so forth. But what's happening? What we witness now in young people is that the land is converting them, and the needle is moving towards indigenous in life and thought, and the church ignores that to its peril.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right. We don't need to look to stuff far away. There's stuff very near at hand, which articulates what it means to live a righteous discipleship here on this land.
On this land and in this place. And a part of what part of the reason we wanted to have you on this week especially is because of the long-term effects of residential schooling. And that's another way, like you say, we arrived and we tried to copy Europe. We not only tried to copy Europe, we tried to eliminate a whole culture by making people European in terms of the mission of residential schooling. September 30th is Orange Shirt Day. And for those who are unaware, Orange Shirt Day is a legacy of really the St. Joseph Mission Residential School, which was in the Northwest sort of as well in British Columbia. They had a commemoration project in 2013. And this orange shirt movement sort of came out of there. A former student, Phyllis Webstead, told her story of her first day in residential schooling when her shiny new orange shirt, bought by her grandmother, was taken from her as a 6-year-old girl. So the annual Orange Shirt Day on September 30th opens the door really to a global conversation. It's a chance for us to talk about all the aspects of residential schools. It's an opportunity to create meaningful discussion about the effects of residential school and the legacy that's left. It's a discussion that all Canadians should have, and we can tune into by creating bridges with others, putting on an orange shirt and opening up the conversation. Why are you wearing that? Well, it's a day for me to stand in solidarity with survivors of residential schooling, and quite frankly, to remember those who didn't survive it because of abuse and quite frankly, murder. So it's a chance to say, as the slogan says, every child matters. Every child matters, even if they're an adult from now on. And so the date was chosen because of the time of year. It's when people were traditionally taken from their homes this time of year and dragged off literally to residential schools. And it's a time for schools in general to set their anti-racism, anti-bullying agendas right now and get the message out there. So on the day of September 30th, humanity is called upon to listen with open ears to stories of survivors and their families and to remember those that didn't make it. You'll find a lot of churches observing it on the Sunday ahead, which this year is the 27th, is upcoming Sunday. Archbishop Macdonald, the legacy of these schools is real, and we've heard it and we've felt it through Truth and Reconciliation Commission and in other places. I wonder if you can talk about why events like Orange Shirt Day are important in our country and indeed in the life of the church, and perhaps share a little bit about how these schools have impacted the lives of people yet today.
Yeah. Well, I think there is, this is an important question for the church in terms of its self-understanding, and the way in which it has also been deformed by the effort, by its involvement, complicity, and at some levels animating role in colonization. And when you see when you see the church justifying this, seeing massive numbers of young people dying, it's an astonishing thing. So when I was first national and indigenous bishop, I would go to visit communities, and if there had been a residential school around, they would take me to the cemetery. And what kind of school has a cemetery?
Yeah,
it's shocking. And anyway, so I think it's important that Canada understand what happened, and I think it begins a conversation. The truth about it the truth has a force, as Gandhi taught us.
Mm-hmm.
Listening carefully to Jesus, he would say, truth has a power to change minds and hearts, and actually to change the structure of socio-cultural life. And I think what we see is that it is a truth that is having a transforming effect on Canadian life. Slowly, much too slowly for some,
Mm-hmm.
but in a way that is important. I think what is important for us to say is that these sorts of things are going on now, the Uyghurs in China, and
Yes.
there are other places all around the world that I'm aware of where indigenous people are facing similar kinds of challenges and difficulties. It is important for Canadian Anglicans not to say, not to cluck their tongues and say, "Oh my gosh, those, how did they let that happen?" And to feel like if they were there, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
I think that the sobering truth, which should also be an empowering truth, is that apart from the grace, power, and love of God, apart from the Holy Spirit pouring love into our hearts, we have the capacity to do great evil as well, even and especially as the church. So it is a living reminder, and we, again, I would say probably just concisely that we still have a long way to go before the truths of the residential school situation begin to penetrate minds and hearts in a broad way.
Well, we certainly would encourage those that are watching our podcast right now, if there's not something going on in your church on Sunday, to make mention of that, and if you don't have time to get orange shirts ordered and all that, to identify it, wear something orange, and be part of that conversation, because it's so important right now. Definitely. Archbishop, you were mentioning COVID a few minutes ago, and that this COVID has been an unwelcome guest in our lives over these last 6 or 8 months, and it's been hard on so many throughout the world, and certainly here in Canada. It's had a financial impact, and it's taking a mental toll for sure. But we've also been learning about how one of the communities hit hardest is our First Nations and Indigenous communities. I know we haven't had a chance physically probably to do traveling and that sort of thing, but can you share with us perhaps a little bit of what you've been hearing or seeing, and reflect on what's been going on in our First Nations and Indigenous communities during this COVID time?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm just back now from a visit to northern BC, and I did also visit Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota in June, and then the Leech Lake Reservation in Minnesota in July. But other than that, yeah, the travel is much less. But what was clear very early on, First Nations reserves were locked down and travel was restricted. In part, we were already beginning to see what was happening to indigenous communities in the U.S. And but there's also a critical awareness of the inadequacies of the distribution of healthcare resources around, and the vulnerability of indigenous communities. They realized that if there was an outbreak in their community, they would be overwhelmed very quickly. So the First Nations communities chose to take a very strict approach to this. And so we realized that in consultation with a number of our leaders, we realized very quickly that many communities were not going to be able to have clergy to show up and help with funerals that were complicated by the further restrictions that had been made relative to the pandemic. So we started to try to bring groups together online to do that. There's some technological challenges for some of our remote communities. And we started the leadership circle, which includes indigenous bishop, elders, and youth. They started meeting every week. Initially, the Anglican Council of Indigenous People would meet every week. And now we're meeting less often. But we also have gospel-based discipleship gathering Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We have 2 youth things a week that we're trying to do our best. Now, it needs to be said, on a good day, things are very hard in indigenous communities. And when you to it this of the pandemic, things get pretty difficult. Now, I think everybody's seen that in all the various contexts that we're in, but in indigenous communities, this has been difficult. And we've certainly seen an uptick in deaths, in stress-related problems, in addictions, overdoses, and sadly, suicides. And so we're doing the best that we can to support people out on the field. Now, I shouldn't say that everything is bad. There's been a renaissance of being out on the land. A lot of people said, well, like, you can't go to work, I'll just go out on the land. So some communities report that they're eating rather well these days, and others report a return to a widespread gathering of traditional medicines on the land and that sort of thing. So there is, the resilience which has resisted hundreds of years of colonization is being applied to the pandemic. So it isn't all doom and gloom, but where we are today is that there are a number of COVID cases starting to show up in communities, which is what we had expected. It's long after every other place. This is the way it was with SARS and what was it, H1N1. Anyway, so there we are.
And there's a likewise concern, I guess. I mean, in terms of the demographics in urban centers, for our indigenous peoples in the cities have been disproportionately affected by the disease, more of them sick, more of them sadly dying. So it also says something about the state of healthcare for our First Nations and Indigenous people. Yes,
absolutely, and the economic vulnerabilities that exacerbate the vulnerabilities of that. I mean, with the consciousness that's developed related to the execution of George Floyd,
right.
I think a lot of people who didn't understand are beginning to understand the built-in brutalities in society relative to people of color, and in Canada, of course, very significantly Indigenous people.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to go next. Actually, that was my next question. Was around for us, a lot of what we've done, even here on the podcast, has been about confronting our own racism, our own white supremacy, our own white privilege, because we've been like everybody else. We've had a lot of things unmasked for us. A couple of our guests earlier in the year talked about this being apocalyptic, in terms of pulling back the veil. And so after the fallout from George Floyd's murder, back where you had spent some time in Minneapolis, there were demonstrations the world over. I mean, here in London, Toronto, all over the world, really. There was an uprising and an awakening sort of people across cultures, across demographics, to cry out about racial injustice. And there seems to be a new awareness around this white supremacy and around white privilege and how some of us have benefited at the expense of others. Part of what I'm starting to query now is how we translate that into real action or real life in a way. So I just wonder, as an example, one of the things that's in the news right now, and I apologize for how I'm about to pronounce this, but the Septemeber First Nation, it's a Mi'kmaq nation, launched a rights-based fishery, which angered non-Indigenous fishers. This has sparked violence on the waters. They've been out there attacking these Indigenous boats. Most settlers are likely unaware of the peace and friendship treaties that were signed between 1725 and 1779 with various First Nations, including Mi'kmaq, of what is now Nova Scotia. And the treaties established peace and commercial relations, and they guaranteed hunting, fishing, and land use rights for the descendants of Indigenous signatories forever. So I guess my question, and this is not one for you to answer, it's one for all of us to answer, but I'd like for you to reflect upon, is how do we translate this willingness, this fresh awakening or arousal, if you will, of awareness? We're willing to march in the downtown urban centers and say Black Lives Matter, and that we're concerned about Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. It's become important for people to say it. How do we take that willingness to do that to, when we see these things unfolding in our country, understand that the people who are rising up for their rights, their treaty rights, that those of us who've benefited from white privilege and white supremacy at the expense of the oppressed, we have to somehow translate our activism, our spoken activism, into something real. And it's a difficult journey, but I think we have to get there. And I think in terms of what's happening on the East Coast right now, there's a really real opportunity. I think about the Anglican Church. Like, what are we saying about this out in the East Coast? How are we standing in solidarity with the Mi'kmaq people or not?
Yes. Well, that's very good. I think that I have heard from many First Nations people that the church played a particular and unique role in the treaty-making era. There are many Indigenous people have commented that if the church had not been there, they would not have signed the treaties. And the church was quite often a signatory to the treaty. Now, why would that be? Well, you see, treaty in an Indigenous context was a largely spiritual transaction in which you made relatives and entered into a relationship of mutuality. It was not. It was not giving away land and authority. It was. It was a commitment to allow each other to live is in their fullness with careful attention to not violating these things. So the treaties become a very important thing, and are today. The treaties are difficult for some people because they have become invested in a kind of internal communal narrative in which Canada is this fair place. It treats everybody well. It's committed to human rights and so on and so forth. And anybody who wants to make it can make it here. All of these kinds of myths that have enchanted people, have beguiled people. And when you see something like this happening, the treaties have a kind of disorienting effect, a disintegrating effect on people. And we're going through that right now. And what happens, in my experience, is people, broadly speaking, do one of two things. They incorporate this new information and reality, a new narrative, in their self-understanding and their communal understanding, or they double down.
Yes.
And we see, Trumpism is a big thing. So the church has a special role. It said, "We'll stand with you guys to the end. We will be tooth and nail behind you." And in fact, the church has largely said, "Well, that's up to you guys."
Silence at best.
Oh yeah,
best, yeah. Short memories.
Yeah. So it was today, to deny the Mi'kmaq the right to fishing is implicitly a denial of their humanity. And I only use the word implicit because of the way in which systemic racism has beguiled people's minds. What should be explicit is not available. So they as human beings have the right to be respected. And this, as some wise guy said, well, you don't want us to fish, give us the land back.
That's right.
That's right.
And pack up and go. And it's, which of course is not realistic, and I don't really know anybody who's advocating that, but that's the kind of situation we're in. So, yeah.
Well, Archbishop Mark, we've been talking about wanting to have you on the podcast because of Orange Shirt Day and to talk a little bit about that. But this conversation has been much richer just than that one aspect of that. So we want to thank you so much for dropping by and giving us your time and helping us to really think about things that often we don't, and talk about things that we need to be talking about in the church. So we're grateful to you and for your ministry, and look forward to seeing you back in London sometime if we can ever get moving around again.
That's all right. Okay. I'm sure I will be. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And before we go, just want to say thank you to our sponsors here on the Vicars Crossing podcast. Again, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, and to Molly Maid. Please do support them as they support us here on the Vicars Crossing. So as we make our way out, again, thanks to Archbishop Mark. My name is Rob Henderson.
I'm Kevin George.
My name is Ian.
And we look forward to seeing you again on the next Vicars Crossing. And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vicars Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicars Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!